Imagine you wake up. No house, no walls, no door with a deadbolt you've never actually used, just you, the open savanna, and something with 6-inch claws and 300 pounds of pure murder staring at you from 20 feet away. That was Tuesday for your ancestors. For hundreds of thousands of years, early humans had no weapons worth mentioning, no armor, no shelter beyond whatever rock or tree they were lucky enough to stumble into. And yet they not only survived, they thrived. They spread across every continent on Earth. They outcompeted animals that were faster, stronger, bigger, and far better equipped to kill. How? How did a mostly naked, slow-running, fangless primate with the upper body strength of a disappointed dad manage to conquer a planet crawling with the most savage predators that have ever existed? That's what we're going to find out today. And I promise you, the answer is weirder, darker, and more impressive than anything you learned in school. Let's go back, way back. About 2 million years ago, give or take a Tuesday. Early Homo, your distant, extremely stressed ancestors, were living in Africa alongside a lineup of predators that reads like a horror movie casting sheet. You had Dinophilus, a saber-toothed cat that specialized in hunting primates. That means your ancestors weren't just on the menu, they were the featured item. There's fossil evidence of early hominin skulls with the puncture wounds of big cat fangs pressed perfectly into the bone, like a nightmarish receipt from nature saying, "We got you." And it wasn't just big cats, there were giant hyenas. And when I say giant, I mean hyenas the size of lions, with bone-crushing jaws that could snap a femur like a bread. There were crocodiles that made modern crocodiles look like nervous lizards, short-faced bears, giant eagles that could snatch a child right off the ground, and then there's Megalania, a monitor lizard that patrolled Australia and grew to somewhere between 15 and 20 feet long, potentially venomous, certainly terrifying. When early humans first arrived on the Australian continent roughly 65,000 years ago, this thing was waiting for them. Not in a welcoming committee kind of way. Let's also not forget Smilodon, the most iconic saber-toothed cat, which roamed the Americas and had canine teeth up to 11 inches. That's longer than most kitchen knives. It weighed up to 800 pounds and had forelimbs so powerful it could pin prey to the ground the way you'd hold down a receipt in a strong wind, effortlessly and with complete authority. The ancient world wasn't just dangerous. It was aggressively, comprehensively, almost enthusiastically lethal. So how did the lineage survive? Let's start with the first and most underrated answer. Your ancestors were absolutely brilliant at not being seen. Early humans were small. Homo habilis, one of the earliest members of the Homo genus, stood around 4.5 feet tall, light, quiet, inconspicuous by necessity, but more importantly, they were observant. The human brain, even in its earliest iterations, was doing something that almost no other animal's brain was doing with the same sophistication. It was reading the environment like a book. The rustle of grass in a direction the wind wasn't blowing. The sudden silence of birds in a tree. The way a watering hole became unnervingly still. Predators are good at hunting, but early humans became good at reading predators, which is a completely different and arguably more powerful skill set. They understood patterns. They noticed that certain big cats hunted at dusk, that crocodiles lurked near particular bends in the river, that some areas smelled like death because something large had just eaten there and was sleeping it off nearby. This observational intelligence was proto-science. It was the earliest form of data collection, and it kept your ancestors alive long enough to pass on their genes. But hiding and observing only gets you so far. Eventually, you have to eat, and that means you have to go out into the world where the things that want to eat you also live. So early humans developed the second strategy. They became the most committed opportunists in the history of life on Earth. Here's something they don't emphasize enough in history class. Early humans were scavengers. Enthusiastic, strategic, unapologetic scavengers. When a lion made a kill, when a pack of hyenas finished a wildebeest, when a predator ate its fill and wandered off to nap, early Homo would move in, fast. They'd grab whatever was left, crack open the bones for marrow, a nutritional resource most predators couldn't access, and get out before anything came back for seconds. This sounds like the behavior of something meek and desperate, but it was actually incredibly sophisticated. To pull off successful scavenging, you need to track predators, understand their feeding patterns, assess a scene quickly for risk, communicate with others, and make split-second decisions about when to approach and when to run. That's a complex social and cognitive operation happening inside a brain that, at the time, was still getting its footing. And here's the key thing about marrow. It's extraordinarily nutritious, rich in fat, protein, and calories. Other animals couldn't get to it because they didn't have the tool. But early Homo did, they'd figured out that smashing certain rocks together created edges that could crack bone. This is the Oldowan tool industry, dating back about 2.6 million years. It's the oldest known technology on Earth, and its primary purpose was not building, not creating art, not any of the romantic things we associate with human ingenuity. It was getting into bones after the apex predators were done with the rest of the carcass. Technology, from day one, was a survival hack, but tools only help if you can use them in time. And in a world where predators were everywhere, early humans needed something else. A way to process danger before it arrived. This is where fear, actual biological fear, became one of the most underappreciated survival tools in human history. The human stress response, the famous fight or flight mechanism, is extraordinarily finely tuned. Your amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, can register danger and begin triggering a physiological response before your conscious mind has even formed a thought about what you're seeing. Your pupils dilate, blood floods your muscles, your pain tolerance spikes, your perception of time stretches. This system was not designed for office deadlines or social anxiety. It was designed for exactly this: a predator stepping out of tall grass 15 feet away. What's remarkable is that early humans didn't just experience fear, they communicated it. The very structure of early human social groups was built around shared threat awareness. A warning call from one member of the group could freeze everyone else in place before they'd even identified the source of danger themselves. This collective fear response, fear as a social phenomenon rather than just a personal one, multiplied the survival benefit exponentially. One person's heightened senses became the whole group's protection. Now let's talk about fire, because if any single discovery changed the relationship between humans and predators, it was this one. The current best evidence suggests controlled use of fire goes back somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million years, with some contested evidence pushing it even further. But what did fire actually do for survival? The obvious answer is warmth and light. But the underappreciated answer is what fire did to the psychological landscape of the predator-prey relationship. Almost every large predator on Earth has a deep instinctual fear of fire. And this is not a small thing. This is a behavioral wall. The moment early humans could maintain a controlled fire, they created a perimeter around themselves that basically no predator would willingly cross. A circle of fire at night turns a terrifying open landscape into something almost manageable. The things trying to kill you are still out there in the dark. You can hear them. You can sometimes see their eyes reflecting the orange glow. But they won't come in. Sleep, for the first time in millions of years of primate existence, became slightly less fatal. Fire also did something subtler, but equally important. It allowed humans to cook food, which made calories far more bioavailable, which in turn fueled rapid brain development, which made humans smarter, which made them better at surviving predators. The loop between fire, nutrition, and brain growth is one of the most elegant feedback cycles in all of evolutionary biology. Harvard primatologist Richard Wrangham has argued compellingly that cooking is actually the defining technology of what makes us human. In other words, fire didn't just keep the predators away, fire made humans smart enough to eventually stop needing to be afraid of predators in the first place. But here's what I want you to really appreciate. None of this worked alone. The most remarkable survival tool early humans had was not a stone tool, not fire, not even intelligence in the individual sense. It was each other. Humans are, in the grand catalog of mammals, not that impressive physically. We're mid-tier at best. But we are extraordinarily, almost absurdly social, and in the context of predator survival, this matters enormously. A lone human is prey. A group of 10 humans with coordinated behavior, shared knowledge, and the willingness to throw rocks is a different problem entirely. Social groups allowed for sentinel behavior. Essentially, taking turns sleeping while others watched. They allowed for the sharing of information. Don't go near the third ravine. There's something large living there. They enabled coordinated noisemaking to scare off predators, because many large predators are opportunists that prefer easy prey, and a group of screaming, rock-throwing hominid is not easy prey. They allowed injured or sick individuals to be protected long enough to recover, which means the group retained experienced, knowledge-holding members that a purely individualistic species would simply lose. There's fossil evidence of early Homo individuals who survived significant injury, broken bones that healed, conditions that would have required prolonged care. These weren't lone wolves who bounced back on their own. Someone took care of them, and that caring, that social investment in individual survival, is itself itself a weapon against predators. It means your group retains its strongest and most knowledgeable members even after they've been temporarily weakened. Compassion, it turns out, is a survival strategy, and language, even its earliest, most rudimentary form, turbocharged all of it. You didn't have to personally encounter the giant hyena near the eastern ridge to know it was there. Someone who could tell you, could describe it, could warn the entire group. This is information transmission across time and space, and it meant that lessons learned by one individual could survive that individual's death and protect people who were born decades later. That is an almost magical capability when you think about it. The knowledge of how to avoid a specific predator that killed your grandfather could be passed down to your grandchildren without them ever having to experience that danger themselves. Language turned individual experience into collective armor. Now we get to the part that most profoundly shifted the balance of power. And it happened gradually, so gradually that you could live through multiple generations and not notice it was happening. Early humans began to hunt, not just scavenge, not just opportunistically grab the leftover. They started going after prey actively, and the way they did it was not by being stronger or faster than their target. It was by being more persistent than anything else alive. Persistence hunting is one of the most extraordinary behavioral adaptations in the animal kingdom, and modern humans are its undisputed champion. Here's the concept. Humans can't outrun a kudu or a wildebeest over a short distance, not even close. But humans can run at a moderate pace for extraordinarily long distances without overheating. Because unlike almost every four-legged animal on the savannah, humans sweat. We have 2 to 4 million sweat glands distributed across our bodies. We lost most of our body hair precisely to optimize this cooling. We have an arch in our foot, tendons that store and release energy like springs, gluteal muscles that stabilize us in bipedal running. The entire human body is, in biomechanical terms, a distance-running machine. Four-legged animals cool down by panting, but panting is tied to their breathing cycle, and their breathing cycle is tied to their gait when running. This means a quadruped running at full speed cannot pant effectively. They overheat, and in the midday African sun, that happens fast. So early human hunters would simply chase an animal, not a frantic chase, a methodical, relentless, hours-long pursuit across open ground in the hottest part of the day. Every time the animal stopped to rest and pant, the hunters would appear again on the horizon, and the animal would be forced to run again before it had recovered. Over hours, sometimes the entire day, the prey animal would become so heat-exhausted and disoriented that the hunters could walk right up to it and kill it with a spear or even a rock. This technique is still practiced by the Sand people of the Kalahari. There is video. It is one of the most humbling and awe-inspiring things you will ever watch. Humans literally running an antelope to death through sheer patient endurance. This is when the equation early humans went from being hunted to being hunted, and they were shockingly effective at it. But persistence hunting was just the beginning. As cognitive capacity increased, so did hunting sophistication. Groups learned to coordinate drive, herding animals toward cliffs or into water where they could be killed more easily. There's evidence from as far back as 300,000 years ago of humans creating spears specifically weighted and balanced for throwing. The Schöningen spears found in Germany are among the oldest complete wooden hunting weapons ever discovered, and they are not primitive clubs. They are aerodynamically sophisticated javelins. Someone figured out 300,000 years ago that if you make the front of the spear heavier than the back, it flies straighter and hits harder. That's physics. Applied physics, solved empirically by people who had no concept of physics as a field of study. And then came the revolution that put distance between humans and everything trying to kill them. Ranged weapons. The bow and arrow appears in the fossil record in Africa around 70,000 to 100,000 years ago. The atlatl, a spear-throwing device that dramatically amplifies throwing force, is even older in some regions. What these technologies did to the predator-prey equation cannot be overstated. Before ranged weapons, engaging a large predator in self-defense meant getting close enough to smell it. After ranged weapons, you could kill something from 30 meters away while it had no idea you were there. The entire risk calculus of encountering a large predator changed overnight, evolutionarily speaking. And those weapons didn't just make hunting safer, they fundamentally altered what animals thought of humans. There's a concept in wildlife biology called the landscape of fear. The idea that prey animals don't just respond to predators when they see them, but constantly modify their behavior based on where they think predators might be. Early humans, as they became more capable hunters, began to exist inside the landscape of fear of other animals. Large predators started avoiding areas where humans were active, not because they feared individual humans necessarily, but because the outcome of encounters had started to shift. When your species starts losing members to a small, weird-looking biped with a stick, you learn to give it some space. Humans went from being a footnote in another animal's threat assessment to being the reason for it. But even with all of this, the fire, the tools, the social groups, the persistence, the weapons, there were still moments when all of it wasn't enough. And I want to acknowledge that because survivorship bias is real. We're here, so we tend to think the story was always going to end with us winning. It wasn't. Neanderthals, who coexisted with large predators in Ice Age Europe, left behind evidence of extraordinary violence, not just on hunted animals, but on themselves. Healed fractures on Neanderthal skeletons show patterns nearly identical to those of modern rodeo riders, the kind of injuries you get from large animals fighting back. They were getting that close to mammoths, cave bears, woolly rhino. They were doing this with spears and stone tools. Many of them didn't survive the encounter, but the group survived. Enough of them, enough of the time, to keep the lineage going. And there's something about the cave bear that deserves its own moment. Cave bears were enormous, bigger than any bear alive. Today, they weighed up to 2,200 pounds, and they shared the same caves that early humans wanted to use for shelter. This was not a metaphorical conflict. This was a literal dispute over real estate. There is evidence that Neanderthals and later early Homo sapiens killed cave bears and used their bones as tools, wore their hides, and possibly conducted rituals around their skull. They competed with an animal roughly the size of a very large car, and they won. Not easily, not without loss, but they won. And this pattern repeated itself across every continent humans reached. When humans arrived in Australia, at least 19 genera of large animals went extinct within a geologically short window of time. When they arrived in the Americas, the same thing happened. Mammoth, mastodon, giant ground sloth, American horses, short-faced bear, gone. The timing correlates closely, almost uncomfortably so, with the arrival of human hunters. This is the point in the story where survival tips into something else entirely. Early humans didn't just survive the predators, they survived so successfully, hunted so effectively, transformed ecosystems so thoroughly that they became the most consequential apex predator the planet had ever produced. Not the largest, not the fastest, not the strongest, just the most relentless, the most adaptable, the most creative in the application of violence. Which brings us to the uncomfortable philosophical punchline at the end of the reason early humans survived the world's deadliest predators is the same reason that many of those predators no longer exist. The traits that made us survivors, intelligence, cooperation, tool use, persistence, the ability to learn and adapt, are the same traits that eventually made us an extinction event for other species. We didn't just climb the food chain, we rewrote it. Here's the thing that ties all of this together, and it's the answer that nobody really wants to give because it's uncomfortable in its simplicity. Early humans survived not because of any single brilliant adaptation. They survived because they were relentlessly flexible. When one strategy stopped working, they tried another. When an environment changed, they changed with it. When a predator became a threat, they learned it, mapped it, feared it the appropriate amount, and then figured out how to deal with it. The human brain's real superpower is not intelligence in the abstract IQ test sense. It's cognitive flexibility, the ability to take information from completely different domains and synthesize something new out of it. To look at a sharp rock and a wooden stick and see a spear. To observe an animal's fear of fire and turn that into a defense system. To feel grief for a fallen group member and translate that into the motivation to protect the living one. Every survival trick early humans developed was a product of this same process: observation, synthesis, communication, iteration. The scientific method, thousands of years before anyone called it that. And there's one final piece that's easy to miss, but might be the most remarkable of all. Early humans survived not just by avoiding death, but by learning to live alongside it. They didn't eliminate all the predators. They couldn't. What they did was develop a working knowledge of when to be afraid and when not to be, of how to read risk and manage it, of how to coexist in a world that had not been designed for their survival. And somewhere in that process, in the long, terrifying, unglamorous process of surviving on a planet that mostly wanted to kill them, they became something that had never existed before. Not just survivors, not just hunters. Something with art on cave walls and rituals for the dead and stories told around a fire about the things that came close but didn't get them. Something that sat in the dark, listening to the sounds outside the circle of fire, and was afraid, but chose to stay anyway. That's you. That's where you come from. And honestly, given what it took to get here, maybe cut your ancestors a little more credit. They didn't have much, and they made it work.